3 points. Firstly, a principle. Secondly, why this is good for people. Finally, why this is good for communities. Firstly, some setup. What is our model? Firstly, the government would provide support and housing if necessary for the people that are going away. I would note, though, that many religions already send people out. The difference for those religions would just be whether those people get a choice whether to leave or stay at the end of the year. But for anyone else, now if they need housing, for example, they will get that. Secondly, people get the choice to stay outside if they would like. We will provide necessary support for them to do so if they need it. But we know there's probably likely to be existing communities of people who have also chosen to stay outside that can provide that support as well. Thirdly, how would we enforce it? Very simply, if religions fail to do this, we would remove tax exemptions on those religious institutions, which is in effect a fine, but it's a fine that we think is justifiable, given we gave them those exemptions in the first place. How will religions likely adapt? We think they are likely to comply for a few reasons. Firstly, the debate to some extent assumes feasibility. Secondly, more importantly, we give them a financial incentive to do so. And finally, I think lots of religions have religious texts to which they can draw ambiguity from. They can explain, reframe the way that the text so that this is permissible. They can explain how, religious norms have historically shifted over time. That's something that's in line with this policy. So let's talk about the principle. 5 parts to this principle. Firstly, the state has a duty to protect people from coercion and allow them to preserve autonomy over their own life. The reason this is true is because the state has a responsibility to individuals to protect their rights, not a responsibility to ideas, religions, or groups. Second part of this principle, the state intervenes historically when people's free will is overridden in such a way, when they are coerced. For instance, the state removes children from parents who are abusing them. The state requires that people get an education, even if that education is against their ideological beliefs. Third part of this principle, the religious institutions failing to give these people an opportunity to see the outside world is a violation of that autonomy for a few reasons. Firstly, because people lack information about what the outside world looks like, so they aren't able to make a free choice about whether they want to stay or not, particularly because these communities are quite isolated in many instances. Secondly, they are often overtly or not overtly manipulated into staying. They are never given countervailing opinions, they are never being told why the outside world might be good. And that's particularly important because these people are victims, not only are they children, but they're also victims to a range of fallacies, such as the sunk cost fallacy of staying and the fear of the unknown. People would prefer the evil they know to the people they do not. The third reason that this is a violation of that autonomy is that these people know no other community and often feel like staying is the only way they can access a community that cares about them. They get told stories that the outside world doesn't have in community. But the final and important reason is they are unable to develop a sense of self-identity. Often their identity is very tightly wound up with their community. They feel they are part of that religious community because they are part of the religious teachings of that community. And you're really not made to identify with a sense of self until you have to discover yourself in the new world. Fourth part of this principle, this model from the government facilitates that autonomy. It very simply gives people information about the outside world, it gives them experience, it gives them a sense of self, it gives them other communities that they can associate themselves with. That is a benefit. Finally, we are able to preserve religious autonomy. Firstly, these people are still able to practice their religion both in the community and while they are outside. Secondly, the religious institutions can still frame how this is presented to people, whether it's presented as a missionary thing, for example. And thirdly, it's only taking away tax exemptions, which is the state's right to do anyway. I would note, though, that this principle is very important in this debate. People in the worst cases are abused. They are the victims of domestic violence in these communities. We think it is absolutely important that we give them the autonomy to escape those situations. But even where it is not, we still think every single person deserves the right to choose where they live, and they deserve information to help them make that choice. Let's explain why this is good for people. The first thing I'm going to prove here is why it is likely that this is a good experience for the people who go on this one-year excursion. The first thing I would note is that religion is likely to prepare them well for this excursion. They have the incentive to do so because these are their children, they care about them very deeply, they are isolated, so they're scared of the danger of the outside world and they don't want harm to come to those who they care about. But also because over time this becomes generational and people have experience of having done this themselves, so they can use that experience to shape their preparation. What does this look like? It looks like giving much more accurate information about the outside world to these children when they are growing up. It looks like giving safety tips and contacts on the outside that these people can make friends with and stay with if they need to. It looks like sending these children out, 18-year-olds out in groups so that they are safe, so that they're with friends, so that they have a good time. All of those things means it's likely to be a good experience. The second thing I would note, though, is just experiencing the world is a fun thing to do, particularly when you've been isolated for your whole life. You can eat ice cream, you can watch YouTube, you can play play a video game. These are things that are mind-boggling for people who've been on a farm for their whole life. That is something that is just a great experience for them to have. We should not deny them that utility. But finally, I think people are likely to feel like they're sharing their religion with other people when they're in the outside world, and that is particularly special to them as well. They care about their religion, and they're bringing that religion, maybe in a missionary sense, maybe just in an information sense, to people in the outside world, and that's something that they gain benefit as well. I now want to talk about the two different stakeholders that are relevant here, the people who choose to leave and the people who choose to stay. For the people who choose to leave, I first want to note that the alternative for these people is likely particularly sad. These are people who deep down wanted freedom, but they were never able to find that freedom. They were locked in a community that was never able to give them what they really wanted. This is good for them. Firstly, they're likely to join a community of other people with similar experiences who have left the same or other isolated religious communities. Secondly, they can access things like higher education and jobs. And maybe they won't be in the most competitive jobs in the world, but they'll still have something that's much more fulfilling than what they likely would have done in the alternative. And thirdly, often they do just escape abuse, which doesn't happen in every situation, but is the most important set of situations. In New Zealand, there is an isolated community called Gloriavale, where women are abused every single day. We would give those women the right to escape. The worst case is that their family excommunicates them or something. We think this is unlikely. The state would regulate this so this doesn't happen because they wouldn't get their tax exemptions. But also, if these people were scared of that, then they might not make the decision to leave, and that's fine. That's a fine decision as well. What about the people who stay? Well, now they know the outside. They have skills that they can bring back. They have knowledge of the outside world that they can bring back to improve their communities. But they also feel like they had autonomy in making this decision. They feel empowered by their religion, which has given them the ability to choose. We think all actors are better off. But let's talk about why this is good for religious communities on the whole. 5 reasons. Firstly, you get more diverse perspectives brought back into these communities from the people who have left. Those are diverse perspectives such as women's rights are important, or gay people exist. Those are perspectives that we think are likely to improve the lives of people, particularly minority groups within those communities. And those people will end up in leadership positions in those communities over time, given everyone is going out at some point. Secondly, it incentivizes communities to be less coercive in the first place, because they know at some point the will will be pulled out from over their young people's eyes, and that means they know that eventually they'll be found out as liars if they did lie to them, so they're going to lie to them less. Thirdly, other people become more aware of these communities because they're in contact with the people who are part of that community when they're on the outside world. Particularly if these people are doing charity work while they're outside, that's likely to give them a positive impression of them. This means people are more likely to feel positively towards those communities as a whole, and that's important for 2 reasons. Firstly, that's the general population that votes on policy that might affect these communities adversely if they don't care about their interests. But secondly, this means that the community feels less of a need to be afraid, and thus less of a need to be isolated from the community, so they're more likely to integrate over time if they're necessary. Fourthly, they can bring back skills and perhaps technology, like new farming practices that will help prepare them for a climate change world. That's probably important, makes their quality of life better. But finally, those who stay actually want to be there, which means you get a tighter community of those who actually are in those communities. That's a benefit to the sense of community that they get as well. For all of those reasons, this is unashamedly a good policy. You should support it.
You can leave and choose to come back in here. Entirely principally illegitimate policy. We've selected you across the line of your race, of your religious tradition, and decided that we're going to take away from you the rights of family, the right to control where you live. unbelievably principally illegitimate. First, on setup, the stuff about then they provide support, obviously we would also provide support to people who choose to leave. The only difference that they can claim in this debate is not support, it's whether or not they take away the choice. Secondly, their characterization that there's rampant domestic violence within these institutions is clearly incorrect. I can't speak to the New Zealand context, but in Australia we had something like that. There was an isolated community called the Family where there were crimes like domestic violence happening, and we went in with the police and we arrested people and we shut that shit down, because being a part of an isolated religious community does not mean you are not subject to federal law, right? If there are actual crimes being committed, we would shut down that community. Argument one, this is entirely principally illegitimate. The intuition here is that we've selected someone along the line of their religion and taken away their fundamental rights. Two things to prove. First, this is discrimination across a protected class. Secondly, it's discrimination for rights that we believe that are important. What are the protected classes along which we discriminate? First, very plainly, religion. Secondly, race, which is deeply correlated with religion. Some of these either correlations or you're just required to be a part of that race to be a part of religion. Third, the lifestyle that they choose to lead, the fact that they live in an isolated community. And fourth, the fact that where they live geographically. None of those are acceptable reasons to discriminate against a person. What rights do we take away from them that we will not countenance in this debate? First, the right to family, the right to be around the people who you love. Secondly, the right to freedom of movement, because you're not allowed to move to the one place you probably want to live, which is with your family, with your community. And thirdly, the right to practice your religion, because often you need to be a part of where the community and with a sufficient amount of other people who are practicing of that religion to be able to access things like rituals and festivals that occur. They strip you of that right to practice your religion. I'm going to prove later that this is harmful, but it actually doesn't matter. The government cannot make a choice that your lifestyle is harmful and therefore restrict your rights, because utility is subjective and because we acknowledge that government decisions are imperfect and we don't constrain the rights that government can take away from you, away from the most fundamental rights. Their logic is like, we can make the decision to take away your rights because the state has made a subjective judgment that you aren't getting maximal utility and accessing other rights from that in the first instance. This has been the justification for every atrocious government policy through the years. This was the justification for the stolen generation. We can take away your rights to your children because we've decided you aren't accessing your downstream rights, like a right to education. The government cannot make that choice. They say, well, they're doing things that take away your rights. We think there should be a very, very, very high bar for when you can take that away. And as I point out, you're definitionally not doing things that are illegal. That makes it entirely principally illegitimate. That will make it entirely principally illegitimate as a basis upon which to take away these rights. It's a very important right. It's being arbitrarily enforced. Even if we can take away people's rights, we think we ought to take people's rights away broadly, not across the axis of clearly protected classes. Second argument, why this year would absolutely suck for the person involved in it. Why is it that they're unlikely to make this year particularly good? First, they want you to come back so they have an incentive not to provide you with things like skills that would allow you to thrive in the outside world. They would also likely teach you directly harmful things. Like, not only would they not give you the skills to find good employment, but they would probably teach you things like you ought not engage with the government services that these guys want to set up, because the government is evil, because they're trying to get you away from your correct religious lifestyle. So that means that they're teaching you actively harmful things. Secondly, it's supposed to be about hardship. Like, the reason that these rites of passage exist is that you go through hardship, you come back and you become a man, which means that the hardship is baked into what they want out of it. And thirdly, you're quite poor. These places don't have a lot of capital because when you're isolated, you don't have the specialization that creates enough efficiency to be able to be rich enough to provide a lot of capital. Their mechanism is the government would just support you. First, I note the chronic underfunding of things like public housing. And secondly, I note that it's likely that these people don't want to engage with the government because they've been taught that the government that this isolated community is trying to keep you away from is deeply evil. What are the harms to the people in this area? First, it's enormously emotionally distressing. You've been ripped out of your home, and it's even more distressing for the communities this is enforced on than it is for the Amish, because it's not your community deciding to send you out, it's the government ripping you away from them. Secondly, enormous amounts of poverty. They don't have the skills to access regular employment, and they're unlikely to access the underfunded services they point to. Third, social ostracization. These people have different customs, they dress differently, they act differently. That makes it incredibly difficult for them to find friends. But fourthly, even if you could find friends, that social life is a pale imitation of your family, which is far more important than being able to access friends. Your mother and father, and not only are your mother and father important to most people, but they're particularly important in isolated communities where you have much stronger family knit connections, so losing them is incredibly important. Fifthly, you can no longer access your religion. As I explained, you need a critical mass to be able to do things like festivals. And 6, you've gone to a place that you've been taught is scary, so you're going to interpret everything around you as dangerous. Even if those things aren't actual harms, you've been taught that they're harms. Additionally, while I've proved this is a harm for everyone, this is particularly fucked for like a very small group of people who will be ripping out at their 18th birthday at the absolute worst time. People who might be disabled, and I note that rates of disability in these communities tend to be higher because they have a particularly narrow genetic pool, which means that you tend to get more genetically created disabilities. People who might be neurodivergent, people who might have just experienced grief. Imagine your father dying a week before you had to leave, and then you have to leave your mother. For this small set of people, this is particularly fucked. Third argument, here's why it's particularly bad for the community. First, the indoctrination would have to increase for 3 reasons. First, you now have more of an incentive to indoctrinate them, such to make sure that they don't leave to overcome the goal that these guys are trying to reach. Secondly, you'd want to quash any ideas that they might bring in from the outside world, so when you bring them back in, you also want to indoctrinate them more. And third of all, you also now have the moral license to do that as this community, because you can say we have to prepare them for the evils of the outside. We cannot protect you from the outside by keeping you isolated anymore, so we have to protect you by indoctrinating you more, by teaching you how bad that these ideas are. Secondly, you're just losing able-bodied people. They don't have particularly deep labour forces in these areas. They're not very efficient workers either, because you can't specialise because you're isolated, which means that the harm to the labour force means you have less able-bodied people to non-able-bodied people, so you have more harms. Third, even if people do leave, you lose the most rebellious thinkers, the people who would have had the most different ideas, who could have come back in, who could have pushed for reform, who could have pushed for all of the change, who could have called out the systems that were leading to the devastation that they claim. I would say that it is an enormous harm to the community. At the end of this, you end up having to indoctrinate people far more, and all the harms that they point out of indoctrination do the impacting for us here. Third argument, here's why it's bad for the people who do leave. The first thing I note is this is the least important argument in the debate, because very few people are likely to leave. First, as I point out, all the incentives to make you come back. Secondly, the strong indoctrination they point to means you're unlikely to. And third, if you believe their characterization of how this is going to happen, you're just going to go to a set of people who we already know outside a part of this community. You're going to stay within your group of friends that we sent you out in a group. It's highly unlikely that many people are likely to leave. The first thing to establish here is people would opt into leaving badly. One, people make bad decisions all the time. Secondly, they're 18-year-olds who are a combination of rebellious and hormonal. And third, they've probably done things in the outside world that they were taught are evil, and they're afraid of returning because they would face judgment for that. Honestly, the most likely characterization actually here is you meet a girl and you decide not to come back. And I know this decision probably isn't reversible for the reason hey, shut up, I have 30 seconds left. This decision probably isn't reversible, first, because if you don't return at the very end of the year, you feel a deep amount of shame about the fact that you didn't. And secondly, these communities probably say you only have one chance to come back because they want to incentivize people to come back, because if they give you an infinite amount of time, you probably delay, and more people feel comfortable taking the risk and therefore going into the future. People opt into this badly and they end up living worse lives. Kat will expand on this at second, but they end up living worse lives without purpose, without the happiness of their family, without the stability and simplicity of being able to live in a community that is more collegiate than capitalism, which isolates us and atomizes us away from each other, in a way that is congruent with your upbringing. I point out these communities probably aren't terrible places to live. They are altruistic. We think it's superior to people who leave and then are never able to come back. My speech not entertaining enough for you?
I was just saying that.
Brent, is that your water?
Yes.
Can I have a little bit?
Yeah, sure. Oh, yeah.
Thank you.
Contrary to what this team believes, being religious doesn't make the outside world more scary. It makes it more beautiful, because when you believe that what you're doing is seeing the world that God has created, when you believe you're coming of age in the way that you're in a way that your religion thinks is meaningful, when you're sharing your system of belief with the world, when you're doing that with a lot of other people who are your age, this is something that feels incredible. You're seeing the world that God made, you're seeing it in a different way. And yes, it's a little bit hard, yes, it's challenging, but it's only for a year. You're probably with people that are like you, that are doing it with you, and you know that at the end of that year, you return return to, if you want to, you can return to your community, you can return to your family, and you can share with them the love and the joy that you get from the outside world that God built for you. This is likely to be an incredibly spiritually meaningful thing for people. And for the people who it isn't, for the people who it is hard, it gives them the opportunity to escape abuse that, as we explained to you, it is extraordinarily difficult to escape otherwise. I'll start with the principles. Their claim is that this is a breach of people's freedom of religion. The first thing that I note is that it's kind of a temporary suspension, and I'm not going to spend too much time on this because Will does all the mitigation to suggest why this is not an absolute violation of people's rights. It's like, it doesn't impact your ability to be religious, it just impacts a specific decision you are making as a religious person. And like, we don't just allow people because they have one protected trait to do everything ever. Like, their argument is essentially an argument in favour of like never fining a person of colour or like never sending a woman to jail. Like, you're not being sent to jail because you are a woman. You're still allowed to, be a woman in all the other ways. It's just there's an additional requirement of you. And the state makes requirements of you all the time. The state requires that you go to school even if you don't agree with it ideologically. The state takes children away from parents even though we preserve parents' rights in a lot of ways. But also, people still have access to community, they still have access to state support. This is not the enormous breach of religion that this team describes. But second of all, we explain that even to the extent you believe that people have a right to freedom of religion, what is more important is that the state has a responsibility to protect people from things like coercion and abuse. Like, for example, the state removes children. And we explain to you in Will's speech to no response that is more important than the state's responsibility to preserve religious freedom, because first and foremost the state has a responsibility to individual people and to protect individual people. It doesn't have a responsibility to abstract ideas and to the abstract codes of religion. Religion is important to the extent that people believe in it and care about it. We protect people, and that is more important. And the important thing that I want to explain here is that other mechanisms for protection of these communities fail for all the reasons that we give you in Will's speech, but for a few additional reasons. Because Matt is just like, oh, well, like, if they're abusing people, like, we'll just send the police in and that will get them. No, that's not work for a few reasons. First of all, people often don't know how to access those services, and it's really hard for the police to, like, just go in and know exactly where abuse is. Often that requires people to speak out and access those services. Like, people don't know police exist, people don't know hospitals exist. We correct for that. But second of all, other people don't see these communities and can't advocate for their well-being and their welfare, which means that vulnerable people inside these communities, because they don't have access, like they don't regularly access the outside world and people don't know about them. We also correct for that. We create more scrutiny, we allow these communities to access the outside world more, which means people can advocate for their rights in ways that are important. But thirdly, we think it's really hard. It is really hard to like know for the state otherwise, without people's reporting, to know these things are going on, unless you're just gonna like send the bomb squad into this Amish community once a year, which we would suggest is also an enormous violation of people's rights. And we would not support that otherwise. It's far, far better to just allow people to see the outside world. Their next claim is just that, this is religious discrimination because this is only something that happens to religious people. Like, as I explained earlier, this is not a specific, like, the only reason that this is only happening to religious people is because they're the only people that it's relevant to. Like, we would also support, like, how do I explain this? The government requires the same thing of everyone all the time. Like, the government requires you to provide a base level of services to your children. It requires you to, send your child to school, for example. That, people only object to that because of personal beliefs that they have. That doesn't mean that the government is discriminating against you because you have that belief. It just means that is a different requirement for you. That is why it's totally principally legitimate. Principally legitimate and principally required. I'll turn now to individuals. First thing I want to deal with is their claim that the religions become punitive and coercive, and that's really bad. A few things to say. First of all, our requirement we think corrects for that. That is first of all because, as we explained it will, if you treat people badly, they will want to leave. So you obviously have an incentive to treat people well when they're younger and in the community, so that they want to return. And their claim is like, oh no, well, you'll just like teach your kid to be really distrustful of the outside world. But I think that's a pretty uncharitable characterization, right? Like, these religions, like, there's obviously a spectrum of them. Sometimes they're abusive, or there are abusive people in them, but sometimes they're just insular, right? Like, they care about their kids, they love them, they want them to enjoy their year, they probably want them to enjoy their year abroad, which means it is far, far more likely that they just instruct their child to stay safe. And of course, telling your child that like hospitals are evil is not the way to do that. But additionally, we would suggest that the capacity for a religion to be coercive is reduced when you give them the lever to leave. Like, if their claim is like, oh, well, they'll be more coercive and punitive when you come back or when you leave, like, you can leave. I don't understand what the coercion that they're describing is. But finally, this is an this is an argument in favour of never giving any abused person freedom ever, because maybe their abuse will be more punitive as a result. No, of course we should allow people to access freedom, and where it is not being provided, we ought require it. The next point is just that, what's it called? A Rumspringa is likely to be unpleasant in various ways. The note that I make here is that if they want to make the debate about like people who are like have such severe disabilities that they literally like can't leave, or like their dad's just died, obviously we'd support things like exemptions. I think that's totally reasonable. But first of all, we think these are largely productive challenges that we explain are really important. It's things like having new experiences, learning about the options that exist for you, becoming independent. And yes, of course, those things are hard, but that is also why they are valuable. That's why it enriches people's sense of religious resolve. It enriches their sense of self and their relationship with the world. Those things are really good. And like, yes, of course, it's going to be hard. Like the first week, I don't know, maybe like cry every night. Who cares? A lot of challenges are emotionally difficult in the first place. That is not a reason to not support them. But second of all, as I explained earlier, this is a temporary challenge. You're likely to receive support while you're over there. Like, you receive support from other people your age. You receive support from the state. Their claim is, well, you don't access state resources because the state is unfunded. First of all, we would suggest it's untrue that these communities are super poor. Like, they're self-sustaining, and we think they're particularly likely, for the reasons we explained, to pool their resources to support their children who are venturing out into the outside world for the first time ever. But second of all, we would suggest that governments do have an incentive to support these groups in particular, because they are a particularly sympathetic group. Firstly, because they feed into conservative religious narratives, like conservative people love religion. But second of all, because this is not like these people don't fall victim to the controversial narratives about giving welfare and funding that other groups do. Like, the government doesn't really have to make concessions to support these people. It's quite a politically easy group of people to support. But I finally just want to mount a defense. Actually, no, I want to mount two final defenses in my last 30 seconds. The first is the people who return. Like, I guess I explained this in my introduction. Seeing the world anew is extremely life-affirming and religion-affirming. Often you feel like you've done a religious duty. You extract a huge amount of benefit from that. You return home to the comfort of home, a new person. That probably improves your community, improves your relationship with your family, and that is good. But finally, we think you should weigh the people who leave to escape abuse particularly highly. Firstly, because we explained that it is extraordinarily difficult to help those people to escape in other ways. But second of all, because those people often are violated beyond belief. They have terribly sad lives in this team's world. Even if you believe that this is an overreach, some people won't enjoy it. We would support freeing those people from this kind of abuse.
The second negative speaker, Toomey.
Kat is right. The world is beautiful, but it is not what kids are taught in these places. The kids who grow up in remote Amish communities are taught that their lives are Edenic. They live in a pastoral ideal, the last refuge from the disgusting concrete jungles which exist in the world, that these worlds which are filled with smoke, violence and suffering, which they will see when they leave these communities. The fact that people have to beg for food and money, the fact that people often survive and subsist without any shelter in the most destitute of conditions, that is the world which these kids are going to be exposed to and realize it is scary and realize it is awful. These kids were not going on some trip abroad to Switzerland to see how beautiful the fucking mountains are. They get exposed to the worst of humanity and the worst lives that possible. So, the first thing I'm going to do here is go through the principle. And the first thing I'm going to start is an intuition, which is just to say, this is not something we force on any other isolated and remote community in the world. We do not touch the Senegalese who live in the Andaman Sea, not just because they've got, arrows and spears, but because we recognize this is a lifestyle which ought to be preserved. We do not touch remote communities who live in the Amazon rainforest, who are able to live their traditional lives, which, to be clear, are not necessarily our lives. They lack technology, they lack education. Many people are not necessarily literate, do not actually participate in other forms of the economy. We do not touch their lives either. So obviously, these people, by their logic, is equally coerced into these lifestyles. They lack the same sort of opportunities, they lack the same sort of knowledge. So why do we make a distinction between between them, it is distinctly unclear why we make a distinction based on indigeneity for the first two examples and one based on religion, unclear why we ought to impose the state's will in our instance, but not all instances there. And that, I think, fundamentally undermines the principled conception of the case, because it is simply something the world does not believe in, and we do believe that people have an ability to live a life which is valuable and different and is still good. But let's deal with some of the more principled contentions here. They say the state has a duty to protect individuals, but this is obviously contingent upon proving harm, which is why I will now reject the characterization that these communities are awful, miserable, and people are constantly abused. Because, for a very simple fact that, well, if abuse was actually occurring, they're still subject to federal criminal laws, so you can actually get accountability there, but simply because people live a different type of life does not mean it is harmful. For example, a poorly educated Amish child in a community might not be able to read super well, but they only grow up to be a farmer and enjoy planting potatoes and growing vegetables and living a very simple life. That is by no means an unhappy life, or one which we ought to intervene upon. And I'd suggest intuitively that the fact that 85 to 90% of Amish people return from Rumspringa and stay in these communities suggests that this is life which is particularly meaningful. But let's give a few structural reasons as to why these communities are not likely to be abusive and are far more likely to be the good communities. The first of which is that alternatives currently exist in the status quo to actually regulate these communities, because all it takes is one person to leave these communities, to shine a light on the abuse which occurs, to get a bunch of government action there, right? It takes one person to leave, to find the police, to speak out about the experience, for the government to come around and know that, well, this is a pretty bad community, we ought to break up. But also secondly, note that these communities obviously have this sort of risk because they're out of sight, means that they're often quite frequently monitored by the state from at least, not necessarily, invading and auditing them, but at least monitored from some distance to make sure people are living well. They're monitored by population levels. They must ensure that these people are still healthy and far more unlikely to be safe. For some reasons to why the communities are likely to be good to you as well, right? The first of which is that these communities are genuinely quite altruistic for the very reason that their ideological tenets rejects things like selfishness, rejects things like capitalism, or being looking out for yourself as opposed to the community. But the second thing is that they don't want people to leave, which is why they're likely to treat people well. The third thing here is that these communities often subsist on things like farming and therefore require every able-bodied person to be able to grow and farm stuff and to participate. If you were to abuse someone and hurt them, this obviously hurts your ability to survive and to hurt your ability to have an enabled worker on a farm as well, which is why, once again, even from a totally selfish perspective, they still want to treat you well and is unlikely to treat you badly. That is why I think the lives of these communities are actually quite valuable and are actually quite meaningful, for the very reason that these people often have purpose. They know why they exist. They're here to support their families, support the community, and that brings them a lot of joy when they go and harvest some potatoes and bring in a harvest each year. They're happy with their families who understand who they are, who understand that they only need very simple things in life and are unlikely to bring in things which are confusing and things which are quite upsetting. And there is a beauty in stability and simplicity, and these are things which we will come to terms with. And the final thing to say here is that because these communities are so communalist as opposed to individualist, there is this constant sense of collaboration and support, which is why you can always rely on other people and know that someone is always going to be there for you, compared to currently, when you live in an individualistic capitalist society. That is not always true. And there are people who seek to undermine you and seek to take advantage of you. This is a simple life, and this is a good life. I do not think this justifies any of the affirmative team's principal justification for no harm has existed and is actually somewhat unlikely to exist. So, at the end of this, I think you ought believe that they're principal force, and this is one principle where you ought believe outside, where religious autonomy is something we ought protect. Now, onto the second question I'm going to ask in this debate, which is what happens to children? Because their claim is that, well, because they love and care for their kids, they were going to teach the kids how to survive, and they're going to make sure they've got good skills so they're able to enjoy the year abroad. But the problem is, our conception of fear-mongering and their conception of care and love is actually not mutually exclusive. Because these parents do genuinely care about the kids, and because they fear the outside world, which is why they have to warn them as well. But a few more reasons as to why, how this could potentially manifest, why it's likely to manifest, is firstly, I think, the advice probably isn't to enjoy the rest of the world. It very much could be like, just stay in your hotel room, avoid everyone, avoid all contact, do not go to a pub, do not go to a party, just stay in your basement, don't turn on TV, you're gonna get corrupted by a devil. I think it's pretty common and the way in which people exist and, do this 1 year of Rumspringa. But secondly, I think the reasons why this is true are a few-fold. The first of which is that if you believe this policy is introduced now, it means the current adults in these communities actually did not have this experience and thus do not have the skills to be able to pass down to their kids in a way which is useful. cancelled, which means the people who are currently giving advice to the next crop of people who are going to go on Rumspringa is one which is colored by their own fear of society and is as a result likely to pass on bad advice, and one which tell them to be reclusive and to stay in their own homes. But secondly, even if there are some free thinkers out in the world, the problem is these free thinkers often do not come back and do not translate that knowledge back to the kids who are now experiencing Rumspringa themselves. But third to note is that even if in the absolute best case scenario, the free thinker comes back and teaches them a bunch of skills, my problem here is that it's deeply unclear to me as to whether they teach the actual skills. Actual skills are teaching you how to socialize, like cool slang words to use like yak or pog or slay queen, like deeply unclear to me. This is the advice they teach these kids. But more so things as like, do not go to the pub, do not be seen about any other person from your community, and for the very reason that they've opted in to come back to the world, they obviously think the outside world is worse than the life which they currently have, which is why they're also likely to be fearful and likely to pass down similarly cautious advice parents would currently pass down as well. That is why it's far more likely on the outside that the advice they get is to stay in your hotel room and don't leave it and to survive this 1 year, because that is the only way they can be safe as well. That is why the conception you're offering this way isn't this a year of war, which is fun and people see how beautiful the world is. This is going to be a miserable, lonely year. This is a kid who is stuck living in fear, who's staying alone in his hotel room, eating food, not watching TV, not having any ice, maybe have ice cream, maybe, I'm not sure. But they're probably going to be alone. They cannot contact their family, they cannot contact any sort of support networks, they don't have the life which they have, and all they want is for this year to end as soon as possible so they can go back home and finally be comfortable. That is the reality of this policy. And if you do not believe by the end of the speech that this is something which is deeply immoral, deeply awful, so harmful to the psyche of these kids, I do not know what else to say to convince you.
Thanks for that speech. I now call on the third affirmative speaker.
First question, does this limit or expand people's choices? If this policy was just ripping people away from these communities forever, maybe their principle can stack up. But we explained this is just a 1-year excursion, which means that this policy is much closer to what the government already does by forcing kids to go to school from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m., 5 days a week, 40 out of 52 weeks a year, than it is the stolen generation. And I think the analogy of schools makes quite sense, because it explains why the government occasionally imposes upon people's freedoms in a limited fashion in the present, such that they experience something that expands their freedoms in the status quo. So Kat says, well, you haven't explained why these communities are actively harmful. Well, the harm here is the absence of countervailing information, the absence and the inability for these people to develop an identity for themselves, rather than one that is wholly tied to the community that they only knew about. So, what do they specifically say here? They say, well, it's inherently discriminatory. And I think the novel push from the second negative is like, well, why wouldn't you just assimilate indigenous tribes? Well, that's because indigenous tribes, their kind of spiritual identity is linked to the place that they live in a way that these isolated communities often do not. That's for a couple of really obvious reasons. The first is that a lot of these isolated communities were migrant populations, which suggests that the reason why they choose to remain in isolation is not really one tied to religious worship. And secondly, structurally that makes sense, for the reason that the decision to remain isolated is often one born of path dependency. The people before them never knew what the outside world is, and that's what exacerbates the fear of the unknown. Thirdly, often these are quite small groups, which means they just have a perceived fear of the majority being uncomfortable, being kind of hostile to them, a fear that is not necessarily ungrounded, which explains why that analogy was disanalogous. But also, we just explained that this is not inherently discriminatory, because we are happy to extend this policy to whichever group would benefit from this. Like if they're just remote communities generally who might need this, we're happy to extend that. And also, note that the government already effectively extends this right to any 18-year-old who doesn't want to live with their parents, insofar as we give 18-year-olds who live independently welfare in order to do that, which is that this is totally inconsistent with what government does all the time. They then say, well, this is a denial of people's rights. What rights? Like the right to religious worship. You can still practice that privately, right, while you're on an excursion. Secondly, the right to be with your family. You can FaceTime your mom and dad while you're on an excursion. Maybe we'll be happy to let you come back occasionally on weekends, right? Or like at best, we need to support them staying 1 year cumulatively, but maybe they could have holidays in between in the same way that school timetables holidays. So this principle does not apply. So, if anything, their principle does not stack up, but this does expand people's choices insofar as it gives them more information to do that, and also gives them the ability to experience it for just 1 year, and then, crucially, they get to decide whether they leave or come back. Which brings us nicely to the second question. How do communities react? There's a bit of a characterization pivot here, because they say, well, communities make it more punishing to leave. They won't teach you skills, they'll brainwash you. And we would explain that they instead make it more attractive to stay because, and to incentivize you to stay when they're given the choice to do so. Why is our characterization more compelling? For 3 reasons. Firstly, because not all communities actively want to hurt their own young people. Like, Kat effectively concedes this, right? But I think the better version of this is like, well, maybe they have good intentions, but they're misinformed about what the outside world is, so they'll give you unproductive advice. The problem with this harm is that it's in short term, like it only applies to parents who have not literally gone to the outside world and know what the reality is, which means that at the point at which this policy takes around 3 generations, people will learn what the outside world is. And I guess like the kind of hidden premise of the negative team is that the outside world is that scary, but we just challenge this on a number of fronts. Like, firstly, this is a government subsidized trip. Like, no, these people are not living in homeless shelters. Unfortunately for the negative team, we have fiat, this is government subsidized, we'll give you housing, we'll give you welfare like any young person has, and fuck it, we'll give you more welfare on top of that because we understand that you're particularly vulnerable, haven't been in the outside, so it's unlikely to be that confronting. Secondly, even if the government wasn't going to give that kind of support, we would know that there are other people that maybe had left these communities, these people would have formed charity initiatives to help these people out, so we have a support network to lean upon, so it's unclear that the real world would be that frightening, and therefore, if the real world isn't that frightening, people will learn that and gradually acclimatize that over time, which means that the advice would be productive over time. But secondly, even if we're talking about bad communities, unfortunately the harm of these communities being more coercive is effectively sunk, so there's no margin, for the reason that firstly, probably the reason why they're coercive is because it's in their ideological practices, it's in their ideology to do so. But secondly, the communities that already are the most coercive already have the greatest incentive to be coercive because these communities, people have the greatest incentive to leave, so this harm is effectively sunk. But thirdly, we flip this. We are the only side that effectively gives people the option to leave, yeah? Like, that is something, so for the set of communities that are very, very bad, it's only our side that gives people the legal protections to leave, gives people the experience that they can learn to live and make the decision. That is exclusive to our bench, which means that even if communities react harshly, we are the only side that provides people an out to the experiences that are largely sunk in this debate. So, thirdly then, how does this benefit the individual? I know that there are essentially like 3 reactions to what this individual can choose. Not only like the fact that they can choose is the benefit we claim independently, but in each one of the decision trees it's still beneficial. So they can either choose to leave, they can choose to return, but they change the community in a way that's beneficial, or they could choose to return and everything's fine and dandy. So I think the second characterization is the most likely, yeah, and I think the negative team concedes this. Like the pull factors are probably quite strong, which means that the vast majority of people do probably tend to come back, but it's still a benefit because they come back with certain skills. Like Kat says, well, what skills are you going to be teaching? The problems that these communities are super agrarian, they need every able-bodied man. Well, they'll bring back a tractor. Yeah, like they bring back farm machinery, so it doesn't have to be that labor intensive, right? That's like the second part about benefit was technology as well as skills. But firstly, like they do teach things that are like the things they teach are that the real world isn't that scary, right? Like they gradually normalize connections between the outside world and the community, which means that over time these communities come out of their shells. They're more likely to have this be a norm that people can interact, and that's probably the best case benefit, right? Because it means that this policy's imperative gradually diminishes over time because people naturally do this anyway, and that is the best benefit because it brings the best of both worlds. But thirdly, I think the opposition are far too pessimistic about how people will react to these communities. Like, yes, maybe if you meet a guy on the excursion, they'll be a little odd, but they're still like a normal, like they're still probably a normal person in every other way, right? So this benefit of decreasing the fear to unknown works both ways. The community themselves feel less afraid, and similarly, the outside world becomes a lot less hostile, and that works in a nice positive feedback loop in a way that means that both the outside and these communities are more likely to integrate in ways that are beneficial. So, to the extent that they choose to return, they're likely to choose to return in a way that changes social norms and brings back handy technology, which means that these communities are more likely to thrive. It means that they come back with the skills and the technology to build up businesses to make sure that these communities are thriving and far more productive. So that is quite beneficial. Thirdly, They say, well, the problem is if people leave, that means the people that stay behind are the most insular and conservative. I think this is only kind of true in the instance in which these communities were so coercive, right? Like the only reasons as to why people would leave is because it was a community worth leaving. And that is a benefit that we're very happy to claim. So, in the instance where people choose to leave, that is an instance where it is good. Secondly, in the instance where people choose to return, they bring back benefits. And thirdly, people are likely to do that. So I guess the last thing to deal with is Toomey's response as to why people make decisions well. Toomey's like, well, 18-year-olds are like horny, I guess. Now, like, look, this is like, but we allow 18-year-olds to make decisions that we've done anyway, right? Like, that is a right that we give to all 18-year-olds. So sorry, mate, don't think that cuts it. Very happy for this.
I call now on the third negative.
French tells us that this isn't forcible separation, this is just a one-year excursion. If I let French go on a one-year excursion to prison, even if that prison was remarkably well-conditioned and had McDonald's and everything that he wanted, it's not the time that's a test, it is the depth of separation from his family, from the fact that he can't do debating in the outside world, the fact that he can't hang out with Bennett, on all these kind of things are such a big offense to his lifestyle, they'll probably hate and resent the fact that I put him on this one-year excursion. And that lifestyle for him can be replicated for these people. These people have grown up in a community where they're used to their insular lifestyle, where they reject their outside world, where they feel like their codependent family support network is an extremely important source of confidence to them. And these are the people now, you're like taking them away from that, and that's why that is something that is morally inexcusable. So, is this morally acceptable? Look, we give the stolen generations analogy. They say, well, this is like when a parent is abusing their child and you forcibly remove them. Which analogy is more applicable in this case? The reason why ours is more applicable is because in the case of a child that has been abused by a parent, what we have done is we've done a legal assessment that someone has suffered a definite harm, a confirmed case of harm, and we've specifically targeted that harm and taken that child away. That is distinct to the stolen generations, because the stolen generations was a policy where we made generalizations about Indigenous Australians as a whole and decided that for the welfare of the race as a whole, we indiscriminately remove children away from their homes. And this is exactly the kind of policy their side supports, because they don't actually have a confirmed case. Like maybe some of these communities have bad things going on, like Kat says, and we don't know about it, but they don't know for sure that these things are happening. And they're not just targeting one person in these communities, they're targeting every single child that is brought up in this community. Every single child in every single one of these communities is indiscriminately and forcibly removed from their parents, from their community that they love so much. That is why this policy is absolutely unacceptable. The second thing I want to point, and this is weird that this has been going on so far in the debate, but they're not the ones that give people a right to leave. Autonomy is symmetric. If you want to leave this community when you're 18 as a legal adult, you are able to, right? There's nothing stopping you from our side on leaving when you're 18. Maybe we'll say, well, it's the money we give as part of our model. Obviously, that's not mutually exclusive. I'm sure the government can provide money to people who abuse and all that kind of stuff. Or maybe, it's the idea they're maybe you want the blessing when you come back so that otherwise it is coercive for you to leave. But obviously what we explain is that at the point at which you are indoctrinated into that community, you probably live in a way that is functional with that community and like that community, having the worst cases of abuse, the worst cases that they try to claim their benefit on, these people would leave anyway. So given legally, there's nothing stopping you from leaving anyway. The only real difference is just their side forces you to leave, right? When people wouldn't have left before. And we explain that that is a principle that is absolutely unconscionable. The only other response to this is to say, well, you can still practice your religion when you leave outside, so you're not being separated from your religion. We'll note that this religion isn't like Christianity, where there's churches everywhere and everyone's Christian in a white country, but rather this is an isolated community where you have a steep and specific practice that you can't necessarily access outside this community, because you might not have the kind of church outside, because you can't speak to your religion
religious elder to confess things anymore because that religious elder belongs in your community. You can't practice totemic or spiritual responsibilities. You can't engage in your lifestyle. Like, for example, you might be vegetarian in a meat-eating country, or you might, like, not want to eat processed food, and in a capitalist Western country, you have no choice but to eat processed food. So, given all of these reasons, it is clearly morally unacceptable to forcibly extract and remove these young people from their families. Given that, now let's talk about what happens to the community. I think the fundamental clash here is like both sides kind of agree like these religions currently do kind of coercive stuff, and the debate is just like, do they become more coercive or less coercive in response to the fact that now these people are going to leave anyway? Their claim is like, well, now they're going to leave anyway, let's just like expose them and give them freedom. Our claim is that no, people will indoctrinate them more. Which one is more likely to be the case? To analyze this, you need to look at the basis of these communities, which is that these communities fundamentally are isolated and are distinct to other forms of religions, right? For example, in moderate Christianity, your beliefs largely do not conflict with general Western society, which means that the Christian church does not need to take the big sacrifice to isolate their own community because they could get the benefits of engaging in civil society and having political lobbying and all that kind of stuff, and still have people do the religion and read the Bible and all that kind of stuff. This is different to isolated communities. When you make the sacrifice of isolating your religion, that is for the express purpose that not only do you believe your followers should practice certain things like believe in God and pray 5 times a day or whatever, but you also have an active rejection of outside evils. You think things like capitalism or things like sex are necessarily evil and bad, which is why your incentive fundamentally is not merely just to allow people to see the outside world more, because the core tenet of your religion and why you're isolated in the first place is because you fundamentally reject your things. That is why on the way up, it is more likely, probabilistically, that our mechanism comes through, because the nature of these isolated communities fundamentally is that isolation and the evils of the outside world is such a core tenet of their philosophy that they'll never turn towards this guy's plans of be like, oh, they're going to leave anyway, so let's show them technology and show them McDonald's. Rather, they'll turn them against that. Lastly, let's talk about youth. Any young person forcibly separated from their family would be cruel. It would be particularly cruel for these youth because their identity and self-worth is fundamentally tied to these communities. Their lifestyle is tied to these communities. And these communities, they're small, codependent, and self-sustaining, which means that everyone, often respects each other in a chain of being, and these people are set up in a way that is mutually beneficial. And that means that for most of the people here, life is pretty good, yeah? It's not our position to say whether it's good or not. They say, well, the people who are abused would benefit from leaving. I already explained that these people can already leave. Kat also explains that if you're forcibly detained, that's illegal. And yes, these communities have little oversight, but all it takes is one person to call out this community for the police to come in and, do things. The last thing they say under this is people come back with skills like a tractor. Obviously, this is unimportant in the grand scheme of things. The other thing I'll note, as Toomey says, is it's not that they don't know the tractor exists, but it is rather that they reject the tractor because they see the tractor as capitalism or something like that, right? Or they see it as processed food and they reject that and they want to eat wholesome food and all that kind of stuff, which means that fundamentally, right, these people don't necessarily bring back skills that are necessarily valued within this community. I'll also note this is an unlikely case to occur because the people that integrate so well into the outside world that they get these kind of skills might be the ones that leave anyway. And the last thing to say is I think they overestimate how many skills a young person picks up on a gap year. 18-year-olds that go on a gap year to Thailand do not come back as trained doctors or with tractors, right? There's very little you can do when you're kicked out into the open. Virtually no capital, no support, everyone discriminates against you. They probably just at best do the kinds of thing Will talks about in this first speech, which is maybe they do some charity, they try to proselytize to some failure, but that doesn't mean they bring back any skills or liberalizations or reform and all that kind of stuff. So what did we explain to you in this debate? We explained to you that this is morally unacceptable. This is more closer to the analogies of things like stolen generations. This is indiscriminate targeting. We explained to you that these communities are obviously more likely to be coercive, which is net harm to not just these individuals but the community as a whole. And lastly, we explained it's obviously just terrible for these youth. They're not going to bring any skills back. Separating them from their families is unconscionable harm. Very proud to
Before I start my speech, Kat wants it known that she can drive a tractor. It's a John Deere tractor, and she's the only one out here.
Good Kat. I can't, I just don't have a license.
Two questions. Is this legitimate? Is this good? They must win both to win the debate. I won't answer the question of whether or not people are going to leave, because no one is leaving. Down the bench we hear you'll be with representatives from the outside, you'll be with a group of people that you came with from the outside, you're going to have FaceTimes with your mum regularly, you're going to have holidays where you come home periodically, and you can get an exemption if you can prove you might have hardship, which I'd suggest is going to be used fairly liberally. Every time they walk back the model, like the holidays is game over for them on people living, right? Like you're coming back every 2 weeks. Like there is absolutely no chance someone is going to end up leaving. Let's start with the question of whether or not this is principally legitimate. They say, well, we should weigh the stop. Well, they say first, well, just because you're a religious person doesn't mean you're immune from the law. But this is not about immunity from the general law. It's specifically enforced against them, and it's restricting their rights, things like religion, not restricting their ability to kill someone, which is what we restrict through the law. They say we would do this for all isolated communities at second affirmative. First, new model at 2A. Secondly, discrimination on culture, also a protected class. Thirdly, even if it's theoretically everyone, it's still discriminatory. Voter ID laws apply theoretically to everyone, but because they disproportionately target African Americans, they're still discriminatory. Theoretically applying to everyone isn't good enough. They then say, well, it's only a year, which would suggest I could commit a crime that restricts your rights if I promise to stop at some point, because it's a time-limited iteration on your rights. They then say, well, weighing of stopping coercion is more important. First, not responsive to what I preemptively explained at one end, which is that taking away your rights now, because we've made a subjective judgment that you're not accessing downstream rights, isn't acceptable. But secondly, even on the weighing it falls, like one, their mechanism of coercion is using certain coercion to stop speculative coercion. And secondly, the form of coercion they use, legal coercion, is more powerful than the form of coercion that they stop, which is like indoctrination mind coercion. So on both weighing metrics, it fails as well. They don't get that weighing. They then say, well, this is analogous to school. Like, we allow homeschooling, and also, they never explain why school takes away the rights that we explain. Things like the rights to family that are clearly more important. They then say, well, it's fine because it's not related to land. As if Brendon Chen gets to select what is the acceptable vector on which you can decide to live in an isolated way. Even if it's not land, they get to make that decision for themselves. My final note here is that, as is pointed out by Kat and David, like, you can leave. Like, yes, there's some coercion, but if it was doors locked, physical force to stop you from leaving, we'd come in and bust the door down. They say, well, we'd never know, which relies on 0 people ever leaving, right? Because if one person leaves and reports on this, then we've got probable cause to get a warrant and knock the door down, right? So let's believe literally 0 people ever leave, we're going to find out at some point. That means their game of analogy tennis here doesn't work. This is clearly principally illegitimate. And I just want to ask you, think about the horrors through history of children being taken away, communities that would be broken up, that could be justified using all of their justifications, right? That it's better for them, that they don't know their own best interest. Clearly, principally illegitimate. Second question, is this good? They say, well, it might just be super fun to have an adventure, but trips aren't fun automatically. Their degree of fun is proportionate to the degree to which you like the place and the degree to which you're equipped to handle that place. That's why I went on a gap year to an Irish boarding school and not a Bolivian drug cartel. And for a person who lives in an isolated community, their skill set and the degree of fear is that they have of the outside world is much more analogous to the Bolivian drug cartel than it is to the Irish boarding school. I'd also note they're deeply contradictory here, because Kat says, well, no, you would find the outside world beautiful and amazing, but Will's mechanism is, you've been taught the outside world is terrible and scary for indoctrination. They then say, well, we can get around all of the problems because we would have government-funded services. First, we directly rebut this. We point out they're underfunded. You're often taught not to access them. But secondly, that's actually unresponsive to most of the problems. Most of the problems we identify aren't poverty. Most of the problems are disconnection from family and religion, which cannot be solved through government funding. My final observation here is that their characterization, which they rely upon in order to make this good, is absurd. We're not talking about places where domestic violence is rampant, because we would have shut those down already. Look, at the end of this debate, it's actually just fucked to tell a person that because of their religion, we're going to take their kids away. I don't care if the AF has decided they're wrong. The AF doesn't get to fucking decide that.
Three issues in this reply. First on principle, then I'll talk about where communities are abusive, then I'll talk about where communities aren't. On principle, Cat Quo explains why this isn't discrimination on religious grounds, rather it's a general standard that these religious communities are failing to meet. Cat Cheng's only response is an intuition pump about Amazonian tribes. Firstly, Brendon differentiates these tribes in 3 ways, but secondly, it isn't actually rebuttal to the mechanisms we give. It's just an example that sounds nice, and then hoping that you agree that that example is a way to beat the principle. David's new responses are 2. Firstly, that it's like prison with McDonald's. But so is school. School is like prison with McDonald's, except it doesn't even have McDonald's. The second problem with this is that prison is the whole world, right? Like your prison is you can go anywhere except your community, so it's not prison and there is McDonald's. David's second response is it's not, we don't restrict people's freedom if there is, we only restrict people's freedom if there's foreshore abuse. The problem is, our principle wasn't contingent on abuse, it was contingent on the lack of information and the coercion that goes on. And this lack of information is exactly why David's argument that you can just leave isn't true. You never have the thought to leave because your community hasn't allowed you to have that thought. That's why this is unjust, that's why the government must intervene. Let's talk about when communities are abusive. I'm starting here because this is the largest scale of harm. Even if it's only the 10% of cases that do need to leave, they really need to leave, and we give them the ability to do so. Negative Team has 2 strategies. The first is denial. We fix domestic violence in these communities with cops. It doesn't happen anymore. This is merely evidence that the problem exists. And you don't have the evidence that David says you need on every single case. Even if one whistleblower comes out, you don't meet that requisite legal threshold, which means that violence still exists for all the reasons we explained. Secondly, they say, well, the community will become more insular because they have an incentive to keep people there. But we beat this in 2 ways. Firstly, we explain they have a counter-incentive to keep their people safe and also not look like idiots when they go to the outside world and see that they were being lied to. But secondly, that they lose capacity to be coercive, that they can't coerce you as much when you have access to everything that the outside world has to offer, that you get to see how you could be liberated. Weigh this material highly, because even if the community does get marginally more insular, even if the worst communities get slightly worse, at least the people who need to leave have that ability to do so. We all prioritize those victims. We think that is the most important outcome in this debate. Let's talk about the most charitable characterization of this negative team, which is where the communities are supportive. And this is the best case for them because that activates their harms of ripping people away from those communities that are so nice for them. Their case is a few things. Firstly, that this will suck for the people. This will be a bad trip, they'll have a bad time. We explain that this is untrue. You have support from the people at home who prepare you for this trip because they have an incentive to do so. You have support from the community abroad who has also been on this trip and chosen to leave and wants you to have a good time so you can see how good the outside world is. You have support from the government, which is providing you with money and housing and the ability to not be homeless. And finally, you get support from the other kids that you're going with as well. You might be just a little 18-year-old, but you're going with all your friends. It's probably a good trip. Secondly, we explain even if there's hardship, that is good. It's character building. Obviously, it's a big change, but it's a big change that allows you to open your eyes and see what the outside world is like. Their second response is to be well, the benefit is not that big. You're not going to bring back a tractor. But the problem is you're going to bring back the idea of a tractor. The knowledge that the world exists, that there is something out there that is greater than the insular community that you have lived in your whole life. And not only does that enrich your life, whether you choose to stay or whether you choose to leave, it also enriches the community around you. Because all of those people now have access to this information. And maybe that takes a generation or 2. But now this community is able to thrive in the long term. It is now able to get government support, is able to get the support of the people who live in it. That is the reason that you should support this model.